Alaska.
Kalaska.
Over the top.
Hey guys!
Hey guys!
Not over the top.
Okay.
That's good. Go.
Hi guys!
That was too much. Go.
Hi guys!
Welcome to Moose Pass, Alaska. Population 213.
Now Moose Pass was originally a work camp during the construction of the Alaska Railroad. It supposedly got its name from a stubborn moose that wouldn't let the mail carrier's dog team pass.
Moose Pass is a great little town to grow up in. I would know because I grew up here. Every year we have a great summer solstice festival. It's 2 days of great family fun, food, and music. If you ever visit Moose Pass,
You really should.
you'll no doubt see the water wheel and the Estes Brothers grocery store. The grocery store was originally the Moose Pass Roadhouse and was down by the railroad tracks. The train would drop off supplies for the local miners in the area. My grandpa, Ed Estes, then moved the building up to where it is now and created the Estes Brothers grocery store.
In order to understand how my grandpa Ed Estes ended up in Moose Pass, you have to know about the Alaska Railroad. The idea of the railroad came from John and Frank Belaine, the founders of Seward. They envisioned a rail line, the Alaska Central Railroad, that would connect the goldfields of the north to the port of Resurrection Bay. A railroad would quickly carry supplies and men north and would securely bring gold and other resources to the steamships at the port of Seward. Unfortunately, the task of building the railroad through such rough and remote land proved too difficult for the company. In 1918, the United States government bought the line with the goal of completing the task. But in order to do so, they needed workers, lots of workers, and that is where my family came in.
Heaven forbid. My name is Jeff Estes.
That's my father.
Okay. I'm the son of Edward R. Estes, R for Rainier, which is where my father was born on the slopes of Mount Rainier.
They came up from Washington on the transport Crook. My father, Ed, was just 6 years old at the time. He had 4 brothers and a sister. His mother's name was Leora, and his biological father was Sam Estes. They arrived in Anchorage on June the 21st, 1917, which was my grandmother Leora's birthday.
Immediately, Ed's father and mother found work with the railroad and started working in some of the railroad camps scattered along the line to the south of the new settlement of Anchorage. There were many camps established every few miles along the rail line. Each one was a mini-town, providing support and supplies for the workers. The Estes family first found themselves in a camp called Rainbow, and then in Indian. Somewhere during that time, Sam left Leora and the kids to head to the gold fields in Fairbanks, where he became known as Sawdust Sam. My grandmother remarried Frank Roycroft. After 4 years of working at the railroad camps, Frank and Leora found themselves working at a camp along the shores of Upper Trail Lake. Later, this camp became known as the town of Moose Pass.
They worked from camp to camp. At some point, they ended up in the area around Upper Trail Lake. They liked the area and eventually settled there.
Yeah, in fact, Moose Pass was a town site created by the railroad around the Estes Homestead HES 220.
By federal law, they were allowed to homestead up to 1,120 acres, but they decided to homestead only 3 acres, which was to allow for the future development of the town.
Frank, Leora, and their kids settled in Moose Pass as the railroad was being completed. On July 15, 1923, President Warren G. Harding came to Alaska to drive the Golden Spike near Nenana. As his train pulled through Moose Pass, people came out to see the president as he passed by.
In the early days, people were always trying to figure out new ways to earn a living. Perhaps the best way to make money was to service the gold mines. There were sawmills and stores, and people would freight supplies out to these gold mines.
My father also ran dogs for the mail. He had the mail contract to haul mail to Hope. Picked them up from the Seward mail hauler, and there was a mail hauler that went towards Cooper Landing, and then he hauled it to Hope.
During the 30s and 40s, my grandfather continued to haul supplies, but instead of running dogs, he used a diesel bobcat. The Estes brothers had a sawmill on Trail Lake, and when they would use the cat to bring lumber along with groceries and equipment to Hope and Forks Mining District. But in the winter, it was a very cold job. My grandfather rigged up a cabin to be towed behind the cat. He'd sit inside the warm cabin while steering the cat with tethers. He was an incredibly talented man. I think he could make pretty much anything.
Frank Rycroft, my step-grandfather, made the original water wheel. He built the wheel to help cutting firewood. Back then, everyone heated with wood. But it was a lot of work to cut wood by hand with a drag saw. You know, chainsaws weren't really around yet. So Frank hooked the water wheel onto an eccentric, put the logs on an X-brace, and let the water wheel do its work. They still had to split the wood, but it eliminated a whole lot of work of getting the firewood ready for the next winter.
There are so many stories about my grandpa. One of my favorites has to do with the porcupine quill and the railroad tie. It takes a lot of food to keep a dog team. It was common to feed the dogs porcupine meat since it was so plentiful. It turns out the railroad was a great way to harvest porcupines. You see, the railroad ties were made from hemlock, a tree that lived along the coast by Seward. Sometimes the tie hackers would cut the hemlocks right into the ocean and drag them by boat to the sawmill, where they would be made into railroad ties. Because of this, the ties had a lot of salt in the wood from floating in the ocean water.
That was a big benefit here in Moose Pass, because those ties that were placed right in Moose Pass were salt laden, which made porcupine harvesting really good. They'd go out in the morning and all the porcupines would be on the tracks chewing on the ties, and they'd get the porcupines and they'd skin them out to feed the dogs.
Unfortunately, one day my grandpa took a porcupine quill directly into his chest. It became embedded and he couldn't get it out. Well, not until many years later.
In fact, my father, when we were sitting at the table one day, had a porcupine quill come out of his cheek. That porcupine quill, when they were tossing porcupines back in the 30s to put on the line, he caught one in the chest. And that porcupine quill migrated from his chest and came out of his cheek from 40 years later. You know, so, and yeah, the doctors are just totally amazed about that whole deal.
I do not remember my grandfather. He died in the fall of 1996 when I was just a few months old. However, I do understand he was a truly incredible person who lived to see Moose Pass transform from a railroad camp into the town that it is today.
He was a jokester. He was very well remembered. You could always tell when he would like to pull your leg, but if you knew him, the corner of his mouth would turn up and he'd get this kind of a smirk, and you'd know when he was embellishing the story, pushing the edge of the truth a little bit much, leading somebody on.
My grandfather died at the age of 84 in the fall of 1996, only 3 months after I was born. However, his legacy lives on in his water wheel, his store, his family, and his community, Moose Pass. As the sign says, Moose Pass is a peaceful little town. If you have an axe to grind, do it here.